guys, this is Mr. Goebel. Welcome to a segment of a test review. And this test review that we're going to be talking about is about, right here, World War I. World War I was very complicated. And since it is such a complicated topic, I had to really narrow it down to the basics. So bear with me, guys. I'm going to cover as much as I can of everything that we basically did in the last couple weeks related to World War I and imperialism. So that's our topics for today. So we got a test coming up. How do I prepare for it? Well, first of all, we have to cover what I would consider to be the main ingredients for a major war. One is basically we've got a transition between an old world and a new world. So the Industrial Revolution, which we covered earlier, we've got nations that have gone into a new industrial age, and invention and technology have also risen with it. So here we go. So the main ingredients I began with when it came to World War I was the idea of the new idea of imperialism. One of the main ingredients of World War I, the development of world alliances, extreme nationalism, okay, pride in one's country, and militarism, the rise in those four things. Militarism in Germany, as well as a heightened nationalism where people are, yes, I'm proud of my country. Just like in America, we've got nationalistic feelings. So nationalism isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it can be harmful if you don't think of other things. You know, there's other ingredients when it comes to what makes a country work. But we're going to look at those things. So let's go ahead and get started. Yes. Okay. So let's go ahead and I'm going to open up. I'm going to shut my my backdrop here, guys. Please make sure that you are checking out my Twitter, of course, to find this video. That you look for any important maps, and of course, at the very bottom here. Guys, get on to Quizlet. Okay, there's a lot of places that you can go and access Quizlet, including the bottom of the unit right here. There it is. Right there's the Quizlet. All right, so here we go. So let's go ahead. So imperialism. Imperialism was not singular to just Europe. So let's go ahead and look at. Go ahead and just and turn on my turn off my display capture. And of course, there's my header for World War I. Yes, that's what we're covering. But imperialism, which led to rivalries between nations. Now, of course, America will follow suit with imperialistic goals and claims, but Germany had been imperialistically involved and in competition with lands that were also claimed by France. We've got the English-French competition that go on, and then the claims of places like the Far East. We've got Germany and England and Russia who are arguing over the building of a railroad in India, and so on and so forth. So we've got a lot of jockeying around, a lot of positioning going on. So we're leaders in imperialism. Claims, remember imperialism, claims by Europeans, big countries, over smaller countries. Here's the graphic showing a little bit of American imperialism. I'm going to go ahead and I think I just leave everything like that. But our claims were no different than European claims. We, as a country, laid claim on places like Hawaii. We annexed Hawaii, for example. We went to war with Spain, okay? And so on and so forth, okay? We turned Puerto Rico into a protectorate. Same thing with the Philippines and Guam and places like that. All right, let me move on. So imperialism. The next thing I want to really look at and focus on is the alliance system. So I'm going to move down to close this down and bring up the alliances. Now, the alliances that were formed by European nations trying to jockey for protection based upon their geographic location. Since Russia, France, and Britain aligned themselves, Russia being on one side of Germany and France being on the other side of Germany, Germany then had to ally itself with Austria-Hungary, of course, to balance out the power of Russia and France over them. Italy would follow suit and join what we would consider to be, these are called the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente, but I called them during class, we changed their names because they added nations to their alliances. So for example, Britain, France, and Russia would later be called the Allied Nations when they add other nations such as the United States to them. During the war, we would add to the war, but we would never be officially aligned to them. Let's get that straight. But Italy, Germany, and Austria, when they would add, say Bulgaria to the alliance and maybe the Ottoman Empire, that would create an imbalance which would have to be balanced by the other side. So the unhealthy state of alliances and different agreements that those alliances basically made with each other. Another issue that made those alliances even more complicated were the relationships between European leaders themselves. This is a graphic showing how Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, the German Emperor, the King of England, and Tsar Nicholas II were all related to the same royal family. They're all cousins. And you guys know what cousins are like and what friends are like. Friends and family members are like. Sometimes family members do not get along, and many times they're in competition with one another. So a lot of people didn't know that Queen Victoria of England was the grandmother of the German Kaiser. Okay, so that just makes those alliances that much more interesting. Another issue is this idea of militarism. Militarism is when a country determines its own power and strength through its military. It basically has to show off military size to get what they want. Basically, militarists tend to use military force either by threats or just to create a size differential. I guess you could call that an intimidation factor. I'm going to go ahead and make that graphic a little bigger right there. There is my militarism graphic. I'll go ahead and stretch that out. Militarism would lead to an arms race. So you've got an arms race by the English with Germany, because Germany basically starts building a navy. Well, the Brits basically protect their island with a navy, and why would the Germans build a navy in the first place when their coastline really doesn't dictate a need for the navy? Germany's basically biggest enemies are on either side of it. They're land powers. Germany also intimidated people by the size of their military. They had one of the largest, strongest land armies. Great Britain felt threatened when Germany began to construct a large navy. European nations were becoming increasingly suspicious and alarmed of each other, so that led to just much more disagreement. So militarism. When we go back to imperialism, we could probably go back to the Spanish-American War when it comes to the United States. One of the things that led to the causes of, say, for example, the American involvement with the Spanish and the Spanish-American War was basically driven by the press. And they called this press, excitement, over exuberance caused by articles put in the paper, buttons and graphics, paintings. This is called yellow journalism. When you purposefully use images to sway people's opinions. Here's actually a piece of propaganda, which is a lot like yellow journalism, trying to get Americans to join the U.S. Army. Of course, Uncle Sam needs you, doesn't he? So I'm going down our script of things that we have to basically cover. Go down here. So to review, let me go ahead and the causes of World War I are many. Okay, there are a lot of main causes: militarism, the rise of militaries throughout the world, alliances, some of them secretive, some of them not so secretive, imperialism, basically smaller nations getting picked on by larger nations, and of course the need to do that because you want to grow your military, and extreme nationalism, where you basically put everything in the hands of the country, and we stop second guessing our actions, and we basically place country in front of everything. All right. Okay, so what starts the war? Okay, well, you've got all these factors working against basically against themselves, against basically the heir to do the smart thing and not the or the logical thing instead of the smart thing, I guess, the smart and logical thing. And let's look at a little bit at pre-war Europe. Let's see, we're going to go there. So pre-war Europe was pretty much set up like this. We have an Austria-Hungary that's aligned with its capital in Vienna. We've got a greater, basically unified Germany, who basically create we call the Allied nations, okay, or excuse me, the Central Powers. Sorry, the Allies made up of Russia, France, and Great Britain. So this map gives us that focus on which country basically aligns itself with which. So now you can see how those alliances were affected geographically. So Germany and Austria, of course, facing an alliance of Russia and France, now have an enemy, guys, on either border. Okay, so it gives you an idea why there was some fear, and why Germany would maintain such a large standing army when you have millions of Russian soldiers on one border and millions of potential Russian soldiers on the other border. So this is our pre-war map. Okay, take careful note of that when it comes to the test. That is going to be on the test. So what starts the war? All right, and we basically talk about the spark that starts the war being the assassination of these two folks right here. Now this gentleman here and his wife were the heirs to the Austrian-Hungarian or Austro-Hungarian throne. So I'm going to throw up that other map, that pre-war map, really quick, and I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. So here's Austria-Hungary right here, and Austria-Hungary dominated the region, and there were many people, many groups, ethnic groups within the Austria-Hungarian Empire. So what happens is there's a lot of resentment being garnered here over the fact that Austria-Hungary controls people that really don't speak German, and you've got Slavic people being controlled by Germanic people. And Serbs that basically believe that other Serbs are being controlled by this great empire, and the people that represent it most are royals. Okay, these two. Now I gave you the story. They gave you the story about the assassination. We talked about Gabriel Princip. He basically was part of groups that were Serb rebels, and those Serb rebels decided to use Gabriel Princip as a tool to attack the royal family of Austria-Hungary as a protest, and possibly, of course, to spark something that would create some sort of change. So in 1914, when the Franz Ferdinand, knowing that the southern part of his country was under a little bit of turmoil, he decides to go on a goodwill tour. Well, he goes down on a goodwill tour, and him and his wife are murdered by Gabriel Princip in Sarajevo. Go back to that town right there. There's Sarajevo, which is right next to Serbia, and of course, there's a large population of Serbs in Sarajevo. So they're both assassinated, And of course, the alliance system goes into action. And of course, you would have a reaction by Serbia going, hey, you basically, we had nothing to do with this murder. And Austria-Hungary said, yes, you did. It was one of your countrymen who murdered my son. This is the heir to the throne. Franz Ferdinand is the son of Franz Joseph, who basically is sad that his nephew is killed, who is going to be king. The reaction by Austria-Hungary is to attack Serbia. Well, Austria-Hungary has an alliance with Germany. Well, Serbia has an alliance with Russia. Russia didn't take too kindly on the Serbs being attacked by the Austro-Hungarians, so the Russians declare war on Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary, protected by Germany, basically gets Big Brother mad. Big Brother basically says to Russia, you can't go to war with my younger brother, and warfare starts. And of course, we get the French that get involved. Hey, we've got an alliance with Russia. Germany, you can't attack Russia. And of course, Germany declares war on France, invades, and Great Britain now has to step in. Once again, we have got a big war. If you want to go back to that graphic at the beginning, the alliances graphic right here, I can go ahead and turn that puppy on, and you can see how that just spirals into not a great thing. All right, so we have the war basically in action. All right, let's go down there. All right. Early in the war, of course, the United States is a neutral party. In 1914, as war breaks out amongst the Europeans, Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, vows to stay neutral. We are not going to get involved in any foreign wars. We must be impartial in thought as well in action. Woodrow Wilson was prepared for domestic issues and was not really a great international businessman. He was a guy that had an expertise in fixing American problems, so he would have to learn those skills as he goes along. So the United States stays neutral. But, okay, I'm going to go ahead and put a couple of these graphics on here. So even though Europeans have long gone to war, the United States has to prepare for whatever to be the worst, I guess. So there's a slow mobilization after 1914 of the Army preparing. Hey, what would happen if we would get involved? Are we prepared to get involved? The U.S. military has at that time about 200,000 active soldiers, and not anywhere near anything that what Europeans are fighting with. So, of course, we do have some things that are beneficial to the Allies other than soldiers and or military equipment. We have something called production, okay? So the United States basically an industrial power. And if we look at the rest of the world here in 1914 and look at the resources, populations, the United States is a big time player. 99 million people, not anything close to Russia. Russia probably has the most potential as far as a military power. Germany, probably the most readiness, okay? Great Britain, probably the greatest navy. So everybody kind of has something special about them. France kind of being the middle child, I guess, if you look at it. Austria-Hungary being that kind of little buddy that you protect. Turkey, looking like they really don't belong in any kind of world, clash because of their lack of anything, especially lack of industrial power. So if we look at the sides, and as the war is shaping up, Germany's kind of the guy to fear. If we look over here to the graphic to your left, look at steel production in the United States, 27 million tons. Look at German steel production, 17 million tons. We outproduced the Germans by 10 million tons. Okay, we've got a very reasonably small sized navy, very more on the line of what the Russians have, but nothing near the British or even the Germans. So quite honestly, the United States, even though we have a lot of potential as well, we really don't have military power yet, okay, until we really ramp up our war production. So what could we do? Well, if there is a war, we can aid the people that possibly we like. i.e. Great Britain and France become the recipients of tons and tons of American surplus grain, corn, and we would also get into the business of arming and building weapons of war for the British and the French incognito. Well, the Germans kind of know that at this point, but the ships basically flagged carrying those goods are British and French, and there are no American. Graphic here kind of says it all. The means of transportation during 1914 were highly dependent on horses, on animals, on horse-drawn equipment. Now, of course, the truck was starting to be mass-produced in America at that time, but in Germany and Europe and European warfare, they still would rely on Old Faithful, which is the old horse and of course the wheeled cart and or wagon. And also the old-fashioned way, how do you get to the battlefield? You march there. I'm looking at this right here, which is a poster that is calling to arms, okay? Members to join the service, okay? The selective service. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this one up here. So in 1917, we're getting closer to war. The Selective Service Act is put into place, and of course that would draft the men into war. Now, the reason why I'm bringing up the American Selective Service now was that that's what Europeans did, and we followed a European model to create military forces. Instead of having large armies standing in times of peace, which is very expensive, we would call up soldiers and create laws to put them into uniform during times of emergency. So as the war basically is unfolding, you can see by nation who basically had to suffer the most, I guess, who is basically filling the shoes of the military. And you can see that the British and the French together comprised a major part of that. Look at the Russians when it comes to soldiers basically being called to service, and how important Russian service was. There's the United States. That's what basically less than a year of warfare. So you understand that French and the British had been at war for 4 years, almost 4 years prior to our entry. These are some of the major battles. This one right here, I talked a little bit about in class, the Battle of the Somme. Over 1.2 million casualties on the Battle of the Somme. 21,000 British soldiers would die on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, which is the battle that basically stops the German advance. All right. Some of the other terms I talk about a little bit. I talk about some Germans, just some slang that's used. I talk about the Germans being called Huns, equating them to invaders from the east. Americans were called doughboys because they were so new, and when they came over, the French looked at them like they were so fresh, like fresh bread. The British basically were known as Tommies, so everybody kind of had, nicknames were used to basically refer to different groups that were fighting. Now, the war itself was becoming increasingly brutal because of the stalemate that occurs at the Western Front. I'm going to go back to the map one really quick. I'm going to go back to the pre-war European map because I have some important graphics there. So Germany takes it upon itself to attack France first, because it knew if it would go to war with France and Russia, that France would be probably the country it would need to take out the quickest if it had to defeat the British, who would later show up. Hold off the Russians and defeat the French, fight the French with your full ability, and hope the British don't join the war. But you can't fight everybody at the same time. But that's not the case. In this war, not only would the Germans declare war mistakenly on the Russians, they would also declare war on the French, which would make them basically fight a war from both sides. Here's the Western Front right here, this red line on this map. And you can see this is the extent of the German advance using something called the Schlieffen Plan. The Germans had a basically packaged plan to take out France. They thought that if they could take them out at the beginning of the war, they could possibly win an all-out war. So the key was to defeat France first. So they went, instead of going from right across land that was occupied, that occupied both their borders, but you attack through two neutral countries. So the Germans have a plan to attack through Belgium and into France, thus surprising the French army, who would basically think they were going to come basically right from the front, right across their own border. The last place you'll expect an army to attack you from is from somebody else's border, is which the Germans do. And they are caught by surprise. The miracle at the Marne occurs. It's about 40 miles from Paris. This line's not perfectly, and they would have considered to be a, in relationship to where it should be a little closer there. But the Battle of the Marne happens. The Germans are stopped. They call it the miracle at the Marne. And the war goes into a stalemate, and it turns into trench warfare. So let's go ahead and look at that really quick. I'm going to shut that graphic down right here. Check it out. Look at that. This is an example of the complex networks of trenches that existed throughout the Western Front. This shows you basically battle damage, and of course the trench lines that connected military positions. Pretty crazy, isn't it? You got ponds, and all these things right here, guys, are explosion craters. Many of these really big ones were actually created by mines, where people would tunnel under each other and then they would detonate massive amounts of TNT. But these right here were created by very large guns, and some of them smaller guns. But every one of these is an impact crater. Pretty massive, isn't it? Let's see. This is kind of a cool graphic here that shows you what an area would look like before a battle, and this is what it looked like post-battle. Check that out. You can't even see the roads anymore. You can't even tell that there was a building or anything that existed in that place. Look at all the impact craters. Millions and millions of shells created that. It almost looks like a forest, doesn't it? But this is an aerial photograph of a front of a front and what it looked like. I'm going to go down here. So as a result of that kind of warfare, no man's land would create. So this was what ground zero would look like, and of course trees would be devoid of any foliage. You've got smoke, and you've got water, and you've got mist depending on the temperature. These guys look like they're dressed for warm weather. Or excuse me, warm weather. They're dressed for cold weather. And of course, look at that. You can see the duck boards that were put out. These are basically boards to keep men from getting their feet in the mud constantly. Of course, men suffered from trenched foot, something which made their feet rot. You get basically bacteria that grow in your feet. They get under your toenails, and it basically rots your feet. Ugh, yucky. So very harsh conditions in no man's land. The other thing that I talk about here, let me go ahead and look at trench warfare, no man's land. I want to bring America back in the war. So how did the United States get into the war? Well, there's a lot of different things. Probably the biggest one had to do with shipping, and of course we supplied the French and the British since they were our friends. I mean, quite literally. The British were our allies. Maybe they became our allies because because of a couple of reasons. First of all, we share a common language with them. The British are our closest neighbor, and of course, businesses could supply them. And of course, yes, money sometimes talks, and the British were willing to pay or willing to basically invest in American banks and we would basically in return sell them war weapons. So we had economic ties with Britain and France. We were never strictly neutral. We sympathized with them. The French helped us in the American Revolution. So we had these really old ties. Submarine warfare was another issue. This is basically a warning that was set out by the Germans as notice to travelers. If you are embarking on an Atlantic voyage, you're reminded that the state of war exists between Germany and yourself. And if you get on a ship, okay, you are basically putting your life at risk. It says vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or any other of our allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travelers sailing in the war zone on ships in Great Britain on her and her allies do so at their own risk. Okay, so that's a warning the Germans put, and this is Washington, D.C., April 22nd, 1915. So that's a warning basically directly given to us by the German government. There were many sinkings of Allied ships, or at least American ships, that were carrying weapons. Probably the most infamous of those sinkings was the Lusitania. I'm going to go ahead and just take this graphic down right here. There's the Lusitania in an artist drawing sinking, and you can see that it looks a lot like the American ship, the British ship, the Titanic. The Lusitania was built by the same company. But this is the Lusitania sinking by a single German torpedo. Yes, 120 Americans were also on board the Lusitania. And of course, this would anger the American government. We would say, hey, you shouldn't do that. And of course, many Americans would be horrified by this act of violence, but people didn't understand that this ship was loaded with contraband munitions. Okay, it was loaded with things like parts for guns and helmets and gas masks and ammunition made in American factories. Remember our industrial capacity. All right, the Lusitania. I'm gonna go ahead and we're going to move on to a little bit of a little war technology. So many technologies would come out of the war. Of course, the fighting of aircraft. The aircraft really began the war from the aspect of basically surveillance. Planes would fly over each other. They would take photographs, and of course that would create targets. So for spying, for those kinds of things. So planes would fight against each other, so that one wouldn't take pictures of the other. The other was the evolution of the tank. Okay, the tank came from the idea, it looks like a big water tank, and it pretty much was a tank. It was something that basically didn't move very fast, but did it affect the war? Yeah, a little bit, but it came very late in the war. But it was made to basically protect soldiers or to help soldiers, to accompany soldiers on attacks. The submarine, probably the most effective war weapon, next to the old-fashioned machine gun. One of the things that's also not in here, which really isn't an innovation, is artillery. Artillery had been around for a long time, but more soldiers were killed by artillery than by submarines, airplanes, tanks, or machine guns. We'd think that machine guns would be number one. It was definitely up there. But the machine gun changed the ability of armies to fight in mass. They could not overwhelm positions because one guy with a machine gun could literally hold off 1,000 other guys if his machine gun kept operating. All right, so there's some war technology. Moving down, we're getting to the end here, guys. So how did the war end? Okay, let's look at that really quick. What are some things that we need to, basically the war ended eventually with America becoming involved. As we basically sent soldiers into the war, we checked the balance of fighting, along with the Russians basically pulling out on the Eastern Front and the United States adding new soldiers in on the Western Front, the Germans were faced with another fresh threat, which they really didn't have the soldiers, the numbers to stop. So it was literally a grinding down process of the German army. So now down to the assigning of the treaty, which is what I talked about just recently. What kinds of items were in the Treaty of Versailles that basically that led to the end of the war, or affected the end of the war and the post-war map? So I'm going to go and put that post-war map up there really quick, just so this map right here. So how did Europe go from the other map to this map? Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit about that really quick, because there are some things that stick out. So let's go back to the Treaty of Versailles really quick. So some of the things that Germany was forced to do because of the war ending for them was, and really them having no power, because the German king would abdicate, he would leave, he would run off into exile, and the French and the British wanted revenge. So one of the things I told you guys is the British wanted money, the French wanted revenge, the Italians, I don't even know why the Italians were in the peace agreement anyway, because the Italians had been on the side of the enemy, and now they've switched sides. The Russians weren't even there, but the Italians wanted some ethnic land to change hands. The United States just wanted peace. They just wanted the Europeans to end the war with no victory. So that nobody would basically feel like they were basically given all the blame. Well, Europeans wanted Germany to basically face all the blame. Why not Austria-Hungary? That's where the war started. The Austria-Hungary basically declared war on Serbia, which led to the beginning of the spiral to war. So Germany is faced with all of the war blame. They were going to take all of it right there, accept blame for starting the war. And of course, people like Adolf Hitler later would really resent this. The German economy was faced with a $31 billion reparation payment. And Germany would have to give up substantial territory, and these lands were in lots of different places. There was the Alsace and Lorraine. Anyway, I'm not going to go over the list, but there were small amounts of land all over Germany that had claims earlier on. For example, West Prussia, which Posen and Upper Silesia, which would become Poland. Well, Hitler wouldn't want that to stand for very long, and so on and so forth. And you'll look at basically anything that the treaty with Russia they gained from, because when the Russians and the Germans signed a non-aggression treaty at the end of the war, a year before the war ended, they signed a treaty with the Russians called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and I didn't talk about that. But that would basically allow them actually some land that they would gain in turn for the Russians basically stopping the fighting. So. And it dealt with colonies and that kind of. So the Germans were faced with a defensive-only army. They were limited in numbers of ships, and they had to demilitarize the area called the Rhineland. And that, if I can land, is this land right in here. This land right in between Paris, France, and Belgium, and the Netherlands, right here. So that's what they call the Rhineland, the land along the Rhine River. Let me go back down. So a treaty is basically signed by the Germans, which really penalized them heavily. And President Woodrow Wilson would suggest some things that could help to eliminate a possible future war. And this is a list of those we call this 14 points. part of those 14 points is also the creation of a League of Nations, a group of nations that would basically cooperate to prevent future wars. So instead of fighting, we would basically discuss things. But on that list of his 14 points, he talks about basically creating and eliminating basically secret treaties, freedom of the seas. You know, the U-boats really affected the United States when we were shipping things to people, and equality of trade conditions, that trade conditions wouldn't be affected by the size of your nation, a reduction of armaments, basically world reduction of armaments, that countries would limit the size and scope of their militaries. If you have smaller militaries, thus smaller wars, adjustment of colonial claims. Now, all these things weren't agreed to because countries like Great Britain did not want to give up any colonial claims to places like India and Southeast Asia. The French didn't want to give up their colonial claims. So as you can see, that wasn't something that was very popular, but the creation of a League of Nations was something people would want to add. It comes down to the end of the war, the post-war European map. I'm going to go ahead and open it up to there. So there's Wilson's 14 points. When it comes to the post-war world, probably nobody was punished any more than Germany than Russia. Look at the lands that were carved out of Russia. We look at some of the lands that were carved out of Poland from Germany, but look, Russia loses Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. Now, why did Russia get punished so much? Because they really couldn't do anything about it. Russia had a revolution. The Bolsheviks were running Russia. It was now known as the Soviet Union. They were not allowed to the treaty table. So later, when World War II would be negotiated out, these lands were basically not something the Russians would want to give back because they believed they were wrongfully taken during World War I. So Russia, of all countries, remember, Russia leaves the war early in 1917, would lose those areas. They would lose those areas to the ethnic groups that represented them. So Estonians wanted Estonia to be for Estonians, Latvians wanted Latvia to be for Latvians, Lithuanians / Polands for Polish people, and Finnish people for Finland. So this is the post-war map. You also notice the breakup of Austria-Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia into little pieces, which at one time were all one entire Austria-Hungarian Empire. And you can see the squeezing of German territory. There's East Prussia right there. So anyways, you could see a massive change. So lost German territory. There's the demilitarized area right there called the Rhineland. They call it also the Alsace and Lorraine. Germany itself. So there's the four countries that come out of there, and the 9 nations that are created as a result of the end of the war. So Austria, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland. So I think that's it. I think I got everything. I'm going to go ahead and just post the last picture right here. This is kind of how the United States is viewed when it comes to this new world that is, of course, be created by the League of Nations. Remember, League of Nations was a dream was dreamed up by Woodrow Wilson, and for America not to be part of their own plan made us kind of hypocrites in a way. But it also meant that we wouldn't have a full consensus on the League of Nations. It never is given what we would consider to be legitimacy. Kind of like the United Nations today has a military arm, the League of Nations does not have a military arm. So later on we'll talk about the United Nations and how the United Nations is different when we create that after World War II. So that's it. That's everything. I guess if I look through that, we talked about, I talked a little bit about casualties. I talked about propaganda and yellow journalism. I focused on basically some slang used. I talk about the unconventional warfare that was basically trench warfare. Territorial, basically rivalries that basically lead to war. We talk about the alliance system. We look at the war and how it generates into a no man's land, a war that's stalemated with trenches. America gets involved through the sinking of its ships by U-boats, undersea boats. One of the things I didn't talk about was basically how America raised money for war, which is basically talked about in one of the questions. So Americans basically borrowed money from itself, and those, when you borrow money for yourself to basically repay later, those are called bonds. So that's something I just wanted to cover in here. We talked about conscription or drafts, how people are brought in to create those large armies. To prepare or mobilize for war, we talk about mobilization. We talk about the assassination of the Archduke to basically begin the war of Austria-Hungary. Why didn't Austria-Hungary get penalized for anything? We don't know. The warnings that were sent. One of the things I didn't hit was this little puppy right here. I'm gonna go ahead and show you that. Remember this little thing that came up in our studies? I talked something about the Zimmerman telegram. Okay, there it is, this telegram received. But the key to this right here is the name, basically, that it's sent to. There's the Zimmerman telegram right there. The Zimmerman note. I talked about the division of the Central Powers, which basically was Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Italy, and the Ottoman Empire versus the Allied powers, which were Great Britain, France, Russia, and then later the United States would join. We were not really part of an alliance, but we would join. Woodrow Wilson and his neutrality, and then later how he would help and affect the peace that would end the war. There's a chart and a graph in there I want you to basically check out. So make sure you check out this chart right there, that one right there, which looks at war production in the United States. Talked about the 14 points. I discussed the cooperation of nations in that. We talked about the pre- and post-war world maps. Make sure you check those out. Compare the two. Know how they look different, okay? Remember that there's more countries in the post-war map. I color-coded it differently as well. The treaty that ends the war, the Treaty of Versailles. Technology, I talked about U-boats, we talked about tanks, land, basically. We didn't talk about poison gas, another technological innovation that would lead to death and destruction on a larger scale. We talked about the idea of imperialism. We talked about nationalism and militarism, the glorification of military power, okay? Remember, nationalism is extreme pride in one's country. We talked about journalism and propaganda. Yellow journalism gets America into the Spanish-American War. Propaganda is basically how Americans are basically pulled into World War I, vilifying Germany, being kind of like a giant brute. We looked a little bit at America. Yes, we were also a imperialist power. Places like the annexation of Hawaii, the Spanish-American War, basically was an example of American imperialism. The Panama Canal, building the Panama Canal. All right, so it looks at alliances. We looked at the balance of power. I remember I showed you that chart that showed you how all these countries kind of related, including the United States. And the explosion of the Maine, okay? Remember the event that led to America getting pulled into, or basically giving evidence to, for the Americans to believe that the Spanish were involved in the destruction of an American battleship next to her shores. The American battleship Maine explodes in Havana Harbor. Remember, that brought us into the Spanish-American War, not into World War I. Okay? Remember, it was the Lusitania that brings America closer to war, and the Zimmerman telegram, and not the explosion of the Maine, which brings us into another war. Remember the relationship Americans have with their alliances, and we are done. That's it, guys. Guys, good luck. Guys, good luck, and study hard. Yes.